On the afternoon of the 9th of April 1962, a quiet arrest took place near a city bus stop in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Federal investigators from the Federal Bureau of Investigation detained a passenger who had just stepped off a municipal bus serving the Northern Transit Corridor. The case file later described the investigation as beginning with a bus driver's report about repeated passenger visits near military facilities. That pattern would eventually become known inside the file as the Route Pattern Report. According to later court documents, the investigation had started 3 years earlier with a routine transportation log entry. The earliest entry appeared in a municipal transit dispatch sheet. The log recorded a stop time of 4:17 p.m. on a city route that passed near a defense contractor office on the outskirts of town. The entry came from Frank Delgado, a city bus driver working an afternoon shift that week. Colorado Springs transit records show Delgado had been assigned to a rotating set of routes serving both residential areas and several roads that ran past support buildings linked to nearby U.S. Air Force operations. His route that afternoon included a stop along a road commonly used by employees leaving nearby contractor offices at the end of the workday. Transit procedures required drivers to note unusual incidents that affected route timing, passenger safety, or operational reporting. Most entries involved minor matters: a blocked stop, a stalled vehicle, a passenger dispute that delayed departure. Delgado's entry was different in a small way. The note described a passenger who had exited the bus at a stop that normally served contractor employees. The passenger carried no visible identification badge and did not approach the nearby office buildings. Instead, according to the route log, the passenger walked along the adjacent road and continued past the facility entrance. The observation by itself did not trigger any immediate response. Public bus routes in the city passed several areas where civilian and military activity existed side by side. Passengers frequently used those stops for reasons unrelated to the nearby facilities. But the dispatch sheet included a short remark from Delgado, noting that the same passenger had appeared on another route earlier that week, also near a military-adjacent stop. The entry did not suggest suspicion. It simply recorded that the passenger had been seen on more than one route, serving similar areas. Under transit procedure, entries of that type were sometimes reviewed during routine supervisor log checks. Transit records from the period show that driver reports were typically reviewed at the end of each shift rotation, usually every few days. In many cases, those notes were never referenced again. But when route reports mentioned patterns across multiple lines, supervisors sometimes checked other dispatch logs for confirmation. Later documentation would show that this short route entry was the first record in what eventually became a federal investigation. The passenger involved that afternoon had boarded the bus several stops earlier in a residential district south of downtown. Witness recollections recorded later in an FBI interview summary described the passenger as quiet and unremarkable. He paid the standard fare and took a seat near the middle of the bus. No conversation with the driver was recorded. Bus drivers during that period often saw hundreds of passengers during a single week. Most were never remembered. But Delgado's later statement explained why this passenger stood out. The same individual had appeared on more than one of Delgado's routes within a short period of time, and each passenger exited near locations that were not typical residential or commercial destinations. Those locations happened to be streets serving military contractors and communications support offices. In early April 1962, the pattern had only appeared twice, 2 separate routes. 2 stops near facilities connected to defense operations. Neither incident violated any law or transit rule. Passengers were free to ride any route and exit at any public stop. Still, Delgado included the observation in his shift log before completing his route. The bus continued through the remaining stops along the afternoon corridor. Passengers boarded and exited in the usual pattern. Nothing else that day required documentation. The log entry was filed along with other routine shift notes before the dispatch office closed for the evening. At the time, no one reviewing the record had reason to assume it would become part of a federal case file. The observation was simply one of many small details recorded during an ordinary transit shift. Yet later records show that the route pattern report would eventually circulate far beyond the transit office. By the following month, the same passenger would appear again in bus logs across multiple city routes. and each entry would place him near another location connected to military operations in the area. For several weeks, those notes remained inside the transit reporting system. But once the pattern expanded to several routes, the logs began to attract the attention of supervisors reviewing dispatch records. And that review would become the first step in moving the observation beyond the transportation department. During the spring of 1962, Frank Delgado worked a rotating set of municipal bus routes that crossed much of Colorado Springs. Transit records from the period show that drivers in the city system typically rotated between several lines over a 2-week schedule. The arrangement helped balance passenger loads across routes and allowed the transit office to cover peak commuter hours around industrial areas. Many of those routes passed near facilities connected to the region's expanding defense infrastructure. By the early 1960s, Colorado Springs had become a center for several military support operations. Offices connected to U.S., Air Force logistics, communications units, and defense contractors were spread across different parts of the city. Public roads ran near many of those locations, and several municipal bus routes used the same streets. For drivers, those areas were simply part of the daily route map. Frank Delgado usually began his shift in the early afternoon. Transit schedules show that his assigned routes often ran through residential neighborhoods first, collecting passengers commuting toward industrial zones or office corridors. The buses typically grew more crowded closer to the end of the workday when employees left nearby facilities. Drivers were responsible for maintaining route timing, collecting fares, and recording any operational issues in the dispatch log. Most of Delgado's reports from that period were routine. Dispatch sheets mention minor schedule delays caused by traffic near downtown intersections. Another entry records a mechanical pause at a stop where a door latch required adjustment before the bus could continue. Occasionally, drivers also noted passengers who appeared repeatedly across different routes, especially if those passengers transferred several times in a single afternoon. Transit supervisors sometimes reviewed those entries when investigating fare disputes or transfer ticket irregularities. For the most part, however, drivers paid little attention to individual riders unless an incident occurred. Passengers boarded. They rode their route. Then they exited at the next stop. In late April 1962, Delgado began noticing a passenger who appeared on more than one of the routes assigned to him that week. The man boarded quietly and did not speak to other passengers. He paid the fare in cash and usually sat alone near the center of the bus. Nothing about the passenger's behavior violated any rule. Still, Delgado later recalled the man because he seemed to appear on different routes serving similar destinations. On the 23rd of April 1962, the passenger boarded a bus. Delgado was driving along a line that connected downtown stops with an industrial corridor north of the city center. The dispatch sheet for that route recorded the bus leaving a mid-route transfer point at 3:52 p.m. according to the time noted in the shift log. The passenger exited roughly 15 minutes later, near a stop along a road that led toward a cluster of contractor offices supporting Air Force communications work. As before, the man did not enter any building near the stop. Delgado's later statement described the passenger walking along the roadside toward a group of secondary streets. The bus continued on its route. Passengers boarded at the next stop. Nothing else required a report. 2 days later, the same passenger appeared again. This time, the man boarded a different route that Delgado had been assigned for the afternoon shift. Transfer ticket records from that day later showed that the passenger had boarded earlier on another line across town. Those transfers were common in the city system. Passengers frequently used 2 or 3 buses to reach work or shopping areas, but the location where the passenger exited again stood out to Delgado. The stop sat near a street used by employees entering a communications equipment facility connected to Air Force operations. As before, the passenger left the bus and walked past the facility entrance without entering. According to the driver's later interview transcript, Delgado began recognizing the pattern during the last week of April. The same passenger appeared on routes serving different parts of the city. Each time, the bus trip ended near another street connected to a military or contractor location. At that stage, the pattern still appeared small. Passengers often moved between different parts of the city for work or errands. But the repetition of similar stops caught Delgado's attention. He began noting the sightings in the dispatch log after completing his shift. Transit records show the entries were short. Most included only the route number, the approximate stop location, and the fact that the same passenger had been seen previously. Those reports were filed alongside dozens of other daily route notes. Yet by the beginning of May 1962, several entries in the dispatch system now describe the same passenger traveling across multiple bus lines. Each note placed him near another location connected to the region's defense infrastructure. At first, the entries remained part of the internal transit reporting process. Supervisors reviewing route logs typically checked driver notes every few days. The purpose was operational. They looked for repeated schedule delays, safety concerns, or transfer disputes that might require adjustment to the route schedule. But when several entries mentioned the same passenger appearing across multiple routes, the notes began to stand out. One supervisor later recorded a short memo asking whether other drivers had noticed the same rider. That question would eventually move the observation beyond the transportation department. For the moment, however, the pattern remained only a series of small notes in a municipal transit log. Each entry described an ordinary bus trip, and each trip ended with the same passenger stepping off the bus near another road serving a military-connected facility. By May 1962, the transit office had accumulated several short dispatch notes mentioning the same passenger. Each entry described a routine trip on a different city route. Each ended with a passenger leaving the bus near a street connected to a military contractor building or an Air Force support office. Most route logs in the municipal system were never compared side by side. Drivers recorded notes for their own routes, and supervisors reviewed them mainly to resolve schedule or safety issues. But one supervisor reviewing the dispatch sheets that month noticed that the same description appeared more than once. The entries all referred to a quiet passenger traveling across multiple lines, and each note mentioned that the passenger exited near facilities connected to defense operations. Transit records show that the supervisor compiled several of those notes into a short internal memo. The memo did not suggest wrongdoing. It simply listed the dates and route numbers where the passenger had been recorded. The purpose was procedural. Supervisors sometimes checked whether a passenger appearing repeatedly across routes might be using transfer tickets improperly, but the transfer records did not show any irregular fares. According to the transit ledger, the passenger paid the correct fare or presented valid transfers each time he boarded. The pattern, therefore, did not involve any transit violation. Still, the repeated route combinations began to appear unusual. One of the dispatch sheets from the 14th of May 1962 included a more detailed log entry. The bus left a downtown stop shortly before the late afternoon commuter period. The dispatch record later showed the vehicle reaching a northern corridor stop at 4:11 p.m., according to the time written in the route log. The passenger exited there and walked toward a road that led to a group of defense contractor offices handling communications equipment. A later entry that week described the same passenger appearing on a separate route that stopped near a radar logistics warehouse used by Air Force contractors. In both cases, the passenger left the bus and walked along public roads outside the facility perimeter. No attempt to enter restricted property was recorded. At that stage, the transit office had documented 4 separate route entries involving the same individual. Each involved a different bus line. Each involved a stop within walking distance of a military or contractor facility. The supervisor reviewing the logs made a note that the pattern might simply reflect a passenger searching for employment in the area. Defense contractor offices in Colorado Springs employed thousands of civilian workers. It was not uncommon for job seekers to travel between facilities looking for openings. But the dispatch memo also observed that the passenger never entered the buildings near the stops where he exited. Drivers had recorded him walking past the facility entrances and continuing along nearby streets. Later interviews with transit personnel suggest that this detail was what caused the entries to remain in the log review file. In most cases, routine observations were removed from supervisor notes once the fare or transfer records were verified. In this instance, the entries were left together in a single file. By the end of May 1962, the transit office had compiled route notes covering 5 different bus lines. Several drivers had now recorded seeing the same passenger. Most descriptions were brief. The man boarded quietly. He paid the fare. He exited near a facility connected to defense work, and he walked away along nearby streets. During the last week of May, the transit office requested additional information from the drivers who had logged the sightings. Frank Delgado provided a short written statement describing the earlier entries he had made in April. He explained that the passenger had appeared on 2 different routes he had driven that month. In both cases, the man exited near streets serving defense contractor buildings. Delgado's statement did not speculate about the passenger's purpose. It simply confirmed the pattern described in the route logs. Around that time, the transit supervisor responsible for dispatch logs contacted a local security liaison officer who occasionally coordinated with municipal departments when incidents occurred near military facilities. The communication was routine. City agencies sometimes forwarded reports if a pattern of activity appeared near defense locations. The memo included copies of the bus route notes and the supervisor's summary of the repeated passenger sightings. The liaison officer's reply did not immediately trigger an investigation. The passenger had used public transportation in public streets. Those actions were not unusual or illegal. However, security offices responsible for military installations often maintained informal records of unusual civilian activity reported by local agencies. The transit memo therefore became part of a small liaison file maintained by a regional security office. At the time, it was only a short report, several pages of route logs, a supervisor note, and a driver's statement describing the repeated bus stops. But once the memo entered the liaison file, the passenger's travel pattern had been recorded outside the municipal transit system. From that point forward, the observation could be compared with reports from other agencies. During the following months, investigators reviewing security records would return to those bus logs more than once, because the entries described a pattern that extended across multiple parts of the city. And each entry pointed to the same question: why would a passenger travel repeatedly across different bus routes only to exit near defense-related locations without entering them? The first outside review of the bus logs appears to have taken place in June 1962. A liaison note preserved in the later case file shows that copies of the municipal transit reports were forwarded to a security contact responsible for receiving civilian observations near defense-related locations in the Colorado Springs area. The note was brief. It summarized the route entries, listed the dates already recorded by the transit office, and stated that the passenger had been seen on several city lines serving roads near military contractor buildings. At that point, the file still described the matter as a pattern review, not an active investigation. The transit material gave the reviewing office something useful. It provided dates, route numbers, and stop locations that could be checked against other routine records. That moved the case from memory to documentation. An AFOC summary prepared later that year referred to the municipal entries as an initial civilian reporting source. The summary did not claim the passenger had tried to enter any restricted site. It stated only that repeated travel near several defense-related locations had been logged by public transit personnel and forwarded through a liaison channel. By then, the route pattern report had begun to accumulate supporting detail. Transfer ticket records became the next layer. Transit accounting sheets from the 7th of June 1962 showed that the same passenger used the transfer sequence linking 2 routes that did not usually serve a normal work commute between home and a single job site. One ticket was marked at 2:36 p.m. on a crosstown line. A second transfer was stamped later that afternoon for a route passing a communications support office north of downtown. That kind of travel was not prohibited. Passengers used indirect routes for many reasons. But the accounting sheet made one point clear. The passenger was moving across the city in a way that matched the earlier driver notes. The route pattern report now rested on more than one driver's memory. It included stamped transfer records. Around the same time, another driver logged a similar sighting on a route serving a road near a radar logistics building used by Air Force contractors. The driver did not know Frank Delgado and had not seen Delgado's earlier notes. That mattered to supervisors. It meant the pattern was being recorded independently by more than one employee. The transit office added that new entry to the same packet already sent through the liaison channel. Later in June, a short review memo from the security side noted a practical limitation. The passenger's activity took place on public streets, near public bus stops, and outside facility fences. No access attempt had been recorded. No restricted material had been observed. The memo therefore recommended only quiet comparison with existing reports, not direct intervention. That recommendation fit the period. Cold War security offices often work through accumulation. A single odd report rarely meant much by itself. Several small records that matched one another could justify closer review. The bus logs were beginning to match. Another document added weight in July 1962. A facility guard report from a contractor site noted that a man matching the passenger's description had been seen standing near a roadside sign and writing briefly in a small notebook before continuing on foot toward a bus stop, farther down the road. The guard report did not identify him by name. It did not claim he crossed onto restricted property. It simply placed a notebook and a repeated presence near one of the same corridors already appearing in the transit material. That was the midpoint shift in the file. The early bus entries had looked like stray route observations. Now, a separate record suggested the passenger might be noting locations, not just traveling through them. The earlier stops began to read differently once that guard report was added. By midsummer, the route pattern report included several kinds of evidence: bus dispatch sheets, transfer ticket stamps, a supervisor memo, a liaison forwarding note, and a contractor security report mentioning a notebook near one of the same roads. The case was still narrow. No arrest had taken place. No charge had been discussed. The passenger had not been accused in any formal proceeding. But the record had moved beyond transit operations and into institutional review. A later AFOSI memo summarized the situation in plain terms. Repeated civilian movement near multiple defense-related locations had been documented across separate dates and separate records. That was enough to justify continued observation. For Frank Delgado, the matter had already left his daily work behind. He remained on his regular routes through the summer. Transit records show the usual pattern of shift work, late afternoon runs, and minor operational notes about traffic and schedule delays. His original entry from April now sat in a file being read by offices he never dealt with directly. By then, the open question was no longer whether the passenger had used several bus lines. The records already showed that he had. The question was whether those repeated trips formed a routine of observation that would appear again in other reports. By August 1962, Victor Karelin remained under review by AFOSI in Colorado Springs, and the open question was whether his repeated bus trips near defense sites reflected routine travel or a documented survey pattern. That sentence appeared in substance, though not always in the same wording, across several review notes from the second half of 1962. By then, the file had grown past the transit office. What had started as the route pattern report now included municipal records, contractor observations, and a small set of security memoranda comparing dates and locations. The pattern became clearer when investigators laid the stops side by side. An AFOSI review note from late August compared the bus logs with facility maps and public road access. The note found that Karelin had exited near at least 4 separate locations connected to defense work: a communications support office, a contractor building handling equipment maintenance, a radar logistics warehouse, and a records annex used for technical storage. None of those sites were highly visible destinations for ordinary city errands. They were not secret places, but they were operational places. People who worked there usually arrived by car, employee shuttle, or a direct commute. The bus routes serving those roads were public, though they were not the most convenient lines for general shopping or casual travel. That did not prove intent. The memo stated that clearly, but it did make one procedural point. Karelin's stops formed a pattern across facilities that had related defense functions, even though they were spread across different parts of the city. The route pattern report was no longer just a list of odd stops. It had become a map of repeated proximity. A second layer came from routine timing. Transit records and follow-up observation notes suggested Karelin usually rode in the late afternoon, often near shift change or near the close of contractor office hours. That detail mattered because those periods created predictable movement at gates, parking lots, and service roads. A person standing near those corridors could observe employee flow, delivery timing, and which buildings remained active late in the day. One AFOSI summary did not claim Karelin had done those things. It said only that his travel times aligned with periods when such observations would have been possible. That same review reinterpreted an earlier detail. The notebook mentioned in the July Guard report had first looked incidental. A man standing near a roadside sign and writing briefly in a small notebook was not unusual by itself, but when the locations were compared against the bus logs, the notebook entry gained weight. It suggested that the repeated trips were not simply aimless rides across town. A small object seen once became more important when placed beside several route records. That was the first real shift in how the file was read. Meanwhile, Karelyn's routine outside the bus routes remained narrow and difficult to define. A local records check found no steady employment attached to the work corridors where he had been seen. An address associated with him placed him in a boarding house south of downtown, where city directories listed short-term residents and temporary workers. A background summary later noted that Karelyn did occasional labor jobs, but the employment trail for mid-1962 remained inconsistent. That inconsistency did not establish wrongdoing. It did, however, remove one simple explanation for the bus travel. If he had not been working at those facilities, the repeated visits required another ordinary reason. The file did not find one. In September, a quiet recap line entered the review record. By then, the route logs, transfer stamps, and a contractor note had all placed Karelyn near defense-related sites more than once. The case remained administrative. No interview had been conducted. No detention had been ordered. The recommendation was still limited to continued observation and record comparison. That restraint is noticeable in the file. Cold War security offices did not always move quickly. They often waited to see whether a pattern repeated under ordinary conditions. Karelyn kept appearing. A municipal transfer ledger from the 18th of September 1962 showed another linked sequence of rides ending on a route that passed a road near communications, storage buildings. The stamp transfer was functional, not remarkable. But it placed him again within the same operational corridor already described in earlier memos. The route pattern report had now crossed seasons. Spring entries from bus drivers. Summer notes from guards and supervisors. Early fall transfer records repeating the same geography. The accumulated effect was procedural, not dramatic. Each new entry was small. Together, they narrowed the range of harmless explanations. By the end of 1962, the file no longer asked whether Karelyn had traveled near military-related sites. The records showed that he had repeatedly. The open question was whether the pattern would continue long enough and clearly enough to justify a formal federal handoff. In early 1963, the review moved from local comparison to direct federal coordination. An AFOC routing note from January summarized the file in narrow terms. It did not describe Victor Karelyn as an agent or assign a motive. It stated only that repeated travel near defense-related locations in Colorado Springs had been documented through municipal transit logs, transfer records, and contractor-side observations. The recommendation was for continued comparison with any future records involving travel, employment, or outside correspondence. That comparison began to widen the case. A records check tied Karelyn to occasional addresses outside Colorado, including a mailing contact in Washington, D.C. The file did not initially treat that as unusual. Many temporary workers and recent arrivals used forwarding addresses. But a later review found that one piece of correspondence connected to Karelyn had moved through an office associated with a foreign trade delegation already known to federal investigators for unrelated monitoring. The record was careful here. The correspondence alone did not establish espionage activity. It did, however, move the file out of a purely local security lane. By February 1963, the FBI had begun receiving summary material from AFOSI because the travel pattern now overlapped with a broader counterintelligence review. At the same time, Karelyn's routine in Colorado Springs continued to produce small, usable entries. An observation note from the 21st of February 1963 placed him on a bus route running toward a road near technical storage buildings used by defense contractors. The time on the observation sheet was 4:08 p.m., taken from a transit reference cross-check included in the same note. Karelyn exited at the stop, walked 2 blocks along the service road, paused near a posted site map, and then continued toward a different bus stop without entering the facility grounds. That note mattered because it matched the earlier route pattern report almost exactly. Same time of day. Same kind of location? Same use of public transit to approach a defense-related site without attempting entry. Important facts in the file were now repeating across separate records. By spring, The case had a stronger institutional layer. A clearance review office circulated a short memo asking whether Karelin's presence had ever coincided with shift changes or delivery periods at the sites already listed in the file. The answer was partial, but useful. Several of the bus stops and roadside sightings aligned with end-of-day traffic around contractor buildings. That still proved nothing about intent. It did show that his movements repeatedly placed him where building use, employee flow, and access routines could be observed from public areas. A second confirming detail appeared in a boarding house inventory note gathered during a local records inquiry. The note listed a small notebook, loose papers, and folded transit schedules among Karelin's room contents during a routine property check connected to tenancy records. No seizure took place at that stage, and the material was not treated as evidence yet. But the inventory line echoed the earlier contractor report from July 1962, where a guard had seen a man matching Karelin's description writing in a notebook near a defense corridor. A notebook mentioned once could be ignored. A notebook appearing again in a different record began to hold the file together. The FBI's first internal summary did not overstate the case. It described the matter as a repeated pattern of public area observation near defense-related facilities, supported by transit documentation, and later corroborated through administrative and field review. The summary also noted a practical problem. Karelin had not crossed fences, displayed restricted material, or contacted known military personnel in any documented way. The activity under review remained indirect. That restraint shaped the next steps. Instead of moving toward immediate arrest, investigators focused on confirmation. They compared routes, times, and locations. They checked whether the same roads, buildings, and service corridors kept appearing. They also reviewed Karelin's employment claims against available records. Those checks produced another quiet inconsistency. A labor history summary listed temporary work that did not match his repeated afternoon travel schedule on several of the dates already documented in transit logs. In other words, on some days when Karelin was said to be working, the records placed him riding buses near defense sites. That was an institutional fact, not an accusation, but it removed another ordinary explanation from the file. By May 1963, three evidence lanes were reinforcing one another. Document records showed the bus trips and transfer stamps. Behavioral records showed repeated exits and short walks near defense corridors. Institutional records showed employment inconsistencies and federal review. The case still lacked a central proof item. No single document resolved it. But the record had become harder to dismiss as coincidence. The original route pattern report from Frank Delgado no longer stood alone. It had been confirmed by time, by repetition, and by records created for unrelated purposes. And once a case reached that stage, federal investigators usually waited for one more thing. Not a dramatic reveal, just a piece of evidence that connected the repeated travel to a usable record of what Karelin was actually tracking. By March 1965, Victor Karelin remained under FBI review in Colorado Springs, and the open question was whether the route pattern report would finally connect his bus travel to a documented collection effort. The file had been active for nearly 3 years. During that time, the pattern had not disappeared. It had settled into the record. Transit entries from 1962 were still being cited in later summaries because they showed the earliest repeated movement near defense-related locations. A FOSI memoranda from 1963 and 1964 added comparison notes, employment discrepancies, and correspondence links. What the case still lacked was a direct record tying Karelin's repeated travel to a usable set of site references. That changed in the first quarter of 1965. An FBI surveillance summary from the 3rd of March 1965 placed Karelin on a municipal bus heading toward a corridor near a defense logistics office on the north side of Colorado Springs. The summary cross-referenced a transit time point of 4:22 p.m. from the route schedule used that day. Karelin exited at the usual stop, walked along the public service road, paused near a delivery entrance, then continued to a bench near a second intersection. He remained there for several minutes before boarding another bus headed south. Nothing in that movement was illegal by itself. The significance came later. 2 weeks after that observation, federal investigators conducted a controlled stop after Karelin left another bus on a route already appearing in the file. The detention took place on the 17th of March, 1965, near the end of the afternoon commuter period. An arrest inventory sheet later recorded the time as 4:46 p.m. Karelin had just stepped off a city bus serving a road near a defense logistics office when investigators approached and detained him under federal authority tied to the broader counterintelligence review. The arrest remained quiet. No public disturbance was described in the report. Passengers continued boarding at the next stop. The bus completed its route. According to the inventory record, Karelin was carrying folded transit schedules, a small notebook, loose paper slips, and a city map marked with handwritten notations. The notebook became the central evidence item the file had been missing. Several entries corresponded to bus stops, road approaches, and roadside vantage points near facilities already named in the route pattern report. Some notes also describe shift timing in plain terms, including when employee traffic appeared heavier or when certain service roads were less active. That was the confirming evidence federal investigators had waited for. The notebook did not transform the case into a dramatic story. It made the file coherent. The repeated bus trips, the transfer stamps, the roadside pauses, and the contractor observations now connected to a documented record of location tracking. An FBI evidentiary summary, prepared soon afterward, compared the notebook entries with earlier transit logs. Several of the listed bus stops matched locations first recorded by Frank Delgado and other municipal drivers in 1962. That comparison gave the file continuity across 3 years. What began as small route notes had become part of the arrest record. Another document added procedural weight. A clearance-related review memo circulated after the detention noted that Karelin's movements had involved multiple sites tied to communications, logistics, and contractor support functions. The memo did not claim he had obtained classified documents. It stated instead that he had compiled publicly observable details about facility use, access roads, and timing patterns. In Cold War practice, that kind of collection could still support an espionage prosecution when combined with foreign contact evidence and repeated site monitoring. The route pattern report appeared again in the charging file, not as a dramatic discovery, as the first dated indication that Karelin's travel was patterned rather than random. Frank Delgado's original entry from the 9th of April, 1962, was attached in copy form behind later summaries. The 4:17 p.m. log time was preserved. So was the brief note that the same passenger had appeared before near another military-adjacent stop. By then, the institutional action was complete. The case had moved from transit records to security liaison review, from AFOC comparison to FBI detention, and from odd roadside presence to an evidence-backed federal charge. For the transit office, the matter ended quietly. No new memo was required from drivers. No route changes followed, but inside the federal file, the original question had finally been answered in administrative terms. The repeated bus travel had not been ordinary commuting. It had been part of a sustained pattern of observation, documented slowly and confirmed only when the notebook brought the earlier records together. Federal court proceedings began in early 1966. The case was filed in the United States District Court for the District of Colorado, where prosecutors presented the accumulated records that had developed over nearly 4 years. The charge centered on espionage-related activity, involving the systematic collection of publicly observable information about defense-related facilities. The court file did not describe a dramatic spy operation. Instead, it reconstructed a pattern: transit records, security memoranda, employment inconsistencies, correspondence links, and the notebook recovered during the 1965 detention were placed side by side. Each document covered a small part of the timeline. Together, they described how the same individual repeatedly traveled to locations connected with military support operations and documented what could be seen from public areas. One of the earliest exhibits in the case file was a copy of the municipal transit log entry written by Frank Delgado. The entry showed the dispatch time recorded on the 9th of April, 1962, 4:17 p.m. Next to the timestamp was the short route comment, noting that a passenger had exited near a defense contractor location and had previously appeared on another route serving a similar area. The entry was not written as a security report. It was simply a driver's operational note. During the trial record review, prosecutors used it to establish the beginning of the observation timeline. Later evidence expanded the pattern. Transfer ticket stamps showed Karelin traveling across multiple bus routes, serving roads connected to communications offices, contractor facilities, and logistics buildings. Contractor guard reports placed him along service roads and public approaches near those sites. Observation summaries from 1,963 and 1,964 documented repeated visits during late afternoon periods when employee traffic was visible outside the facilities. Finally, the notebook recovered during the 1965 detention connected the earlier entries to a set of handwritten notes listing bus stops, surrounding streets, and approximate activity patterns around several defense-related locations. The notebook did not contain classified information, but investigators argued that it demonstrated a sustained effort to record operational details from publicly accessible vantage points. Federal prosecutors presented the case under statutes addressing espionage activities involving the collection and transmission of defense-related information. Court transcripts show that the defense argued Karelin had simply traveled through the city and recorded observations available to any civilian. The prosecution countered that the pattern, the documentation, and the contact evidence tied to foreign offices showed an organized effort to collect information about military support infrastructure. The court ultimately accepted the prosecution's interpretation. In March 1966, Victor Karelin was convicted on federal charges related to espionage activity involving the collection of defense-related operational details. Sentencing records show that Karelin received a prison term under federal statute and was later scheduled for deportation proceedings following the completion of his sentence. The case file did not end with the court decision. Administrative records documented the longer consequences. Karelin's residency status in the United States was terminated after the conviction. Family members listed in earlier immigration records relocated within the following year. Several defense contractors referenced the case internally when reviewing their own perimeter monitoring procedures during the late 1960s. The file also remained in circulation within security training materials. Later memoranda used the case as an example of how repeated civilian observations near defense facilities could be identified through ordinary institutional reporting. The records emphasized that the earliest documentation had come from a municipal transit log rather than a formal intelligence source. Years later, the case remained part of archived counterintelligence reference files. The route pattern report, written by Frank Delgado, was still preserved at the beginning of the document sequence. It appeared as the first small record in a chain that eventually reached federal court. In later files from the same security offices, similar reviews of civilian movement near defense-related locations appear in routine monitoring records.